Your Royal Highness, Tan Sri, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the panel discussion for this second session. Let me start by thanking Alan for setting the context through his excellent description of the patterns and trends of Malaysian income distribution over the years. But maybe before we actually start the discussion, can I just remind the audience to please put up any questions that you may have on our Slido. Our website was indicated earlier. Now, it gives me great pleasure to call upon Professor Dr. Wee Chong Hui to make her presentation. Dr. Hui.
Yeah, thank you, Your Royal Highness. Distinguished guests, I will, in a way, complement what Dr. Alan has presented. Okay, the main source of household income is from paid employment, followed by self-employment, property and investment, and current transfer. And of the employed persons, most are employees, followed by on-account worker, unpaid family worker, and employer. Now, the monthly wage, right? We just look at within the, Ellen looks at the macro picture, we look at the smaller subsectors. Now, the monthly wage for male is higher than the female, and of course, female labor participation is lower, so we have less number of workers. Now, this is the mean to medium ratio that shows you within each group how is the distribution. Now, if you look at that, yeah, the wage for male is higher, but from 2010 to 2016, it is getting more unequal amongst the male workers, whereas for the women, though the wage rate is lower, within that group, it is more even in the sense of the mean being lower than the medium relative to the male. We look at education, right? Generally, at the macro level, the higher the education, then the higher is the income. Now, so the question of access to education is important. And if you look at the distance of the household, of the housing units from the nearest government schools, you find that in the case of Sabah and Sarawak being very large states, a lot of the households are actually more than 9 kilometers from the nearest government secondary school. And it's not just a matter of distance, the paved roads, right? The percentage of paved roads in Sabah and Sarawak is also low. If you look at that, they are right at the bottom. So this is access to education that will probably generally affect the wage rate by education. Now, having said that, we now look at within each group of the same educational level. And this, in a way, it's like what Ellen has presented, right? For the tertiary education, from 2010 to 2016, it is actually, it is actually, inequality is increasing. There is the red line, Whereas for the secondary education, it is decreasing, and so is the case for primary education. And finally, for the non-formal education, it is increasing. So at the moment, that means the middle two, right? Within that group of the middle two, there are more equal distribution. Now, by occupation, you have that hierarchy, the managers, the highest, followed by professionals, technicians, and so forth. Now, again, this is the mean to median ratio, and I have put the 4 graphs together so that you can compare. But because of the limitation of space, I would like to point out that the vertical axis, actually, they are not all the same. So some of the difference may be exaggerated, okay? Now, if you look at the top left, right, for the managers, of course, it fluctuates, and it ends up more unequal. I guess it's a matter of demand and supply of labor, right? Then, for the technicians, there is a slight decrease over that period. And again, that same graph, professionals, it is decreased. So that means if you are a technical person, if you are a professional, then compared to your colleagues doing the same occupation, there is more equality compared to the managers. Now, next we go to the right, top right. You have the clerical support staff increasing inequality, whereas for the service and sales workers, decreasing. Now, these two groups are actually the largest group of workers. So in that sense, you can say that, that is good news, okay? Then the bottom left, this is good, right? Inequality is decreasing, and you will notice that it is the skilled workers and the craft and related. Nonetheless, these are actually very small number of workers. And finally, the plant and machine operator, slight decrease, and same with elementary occupation. Now, between urban and rural sector, the urban areas, the average wage is higher compared to the rural area, and in the urban area, there are more workers as well. But it is in the rural area that the inequality is falling within that period, okay? Whereas for the urban area, the inequality in wage rate is increasing. Now we look at the states. Now I show the states because, you see, we have been talking about the household income and the wage rate, but all these are in ringgit. And in different states, you have different cost of living. In fact, even within the same state, sometimes you have different costs of living. And so the real wage is actually not really reflected by the household income. Yeah, we have our limitation. So because of that, I look at within the state, I break up into the state. And here also, I look at the number of workers, okay? And you will notice that on the, Selangor has actually one of the highest number of workers. If you look at Selangor on the left side, right at the bottom, okay? And then the Wilayah Persekutuan, okay? On the right, somewhere in the middle there, right? You have KL, okay? Then Johor also, the number of workers is relatively large compared to the other states. Okay. Now, we start with the bottom right. Sabah and Sarawak, the inequality is falling. That is good news. Okay. You move to the left to the wilayah. Okay. Also is decreasing over that period, except for KL. Then you go to the top right. Selangor is decreasing slightly. Terengganu, it is increasing. On the left top, Kelantan is increasing. And then Penang also is increasing. Property. I think this is one that we can look at. Deteriorating or dilapidated household unit, it is highest in Kelantan, Sabah, and Sarawak. Car ownership also lowest in Kelantan, Sabah, and Sarawak. Household expenditure, if we use that to reflect equality, then between 2009 and 2014, it improves, but not so in recent years, right? Between 2014 and 2016. Do I have? Sorry. Okay, I think I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wee, for drilling down into some of the details of income distribution and the factors that are related to the distribution. Now, can I call upon Datuk, Dr. Denison Jayasooria to give us his presentation. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Tuanku. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I would like to thank the organizers for extending this invitation to me. But from morning, I've been wondering, what is a sociologist doing amidst economists who are parodying all kinds of charts and tables and statistics? So I thought, while I agree with Alan and some of his analysis and from the first panel as well, but to complement statistical data with reality on the ground, to look at what one might call the face of the poor, or reality of poverty, the experience of deprivation, which moves beyond statistics, figures, and numbers. While these do show, and I think it is true to affirm from our policy intervention through the 5-year development planning, as well as the effective social policies that have been implemented, whether education, health, rural development, entrepreneurship, has contributed in a tremendous way to addressing poverty and inequality. But we do see the face of the poor and the issues of deprivation on the ground. And those are some things that I would like to highlight to complement the statistics and figures. I think one of the points that the panelists, even in the first session, through their conclusions, have highlighted, while income data provides employment and other patterns, but there is, of course, the need to look at disaggregated data. I think through the questions we heard, what is the dimension of gender or sub-ethnicity? And that will begin to show different figures to the generic data that is provided, however important, but it doesn't capture adequately. For example, if we say that there are more girls in schools now and they're doing extremely well in primary, secondary, and even higher education, but if we start looking at disaggregated data to young girls in Sabah or Sarawak, like the Millennium Development Goals report show, then there is a drop of girls' participation in higher education, or the remunerations for jobs might differ on the basis of gender. Or if one then looks at disaggregated data of indigenous people or people in low-income jobs, then we would begin to see deprivations in completely different ways. So whether gender, sub-ethnicity, indigenous people, urban poor, displaced plantations, within the context of foreign labor, cheap foreign labor, exploitated labor with very little protection based on their rights, then we see a different picture from the ground. And that's something I feel we need to add on to the discussion, as I think Alan alluded that majority of us might not be in the bottom 40% in this discussion. Now, one of the things that the 11th Malaysia Plan has very effectively listed out is a shift from income dimension to multidimensional poverty. And they bring out the 4 dimensions of income, education, health, and living standards. 4 dimensions and 11 indicators. While I don't agree with many of their indicators eventually, because it narrows down very much to rural poverty and doesn't capture the essence of urban poverty. Nonetheless, the 11th plan is a major shift in the way of looking at poverty and inequality, where they begin to look at very poor, vulnerable poor, and aspirational poor. And I think it's in the work of Amartya Sen that he brings out that we need to move beyond income and GDP and GNI and look at the capabilities. And others have called for not just income and these data, but quality of life, using other measures to measure the real experiences of people. And I think Alan brought out the theme of the 20, middle 40, bottom 40, and the experiences and issues and the possibility of moving out through social mobility would be different. And I think Khazanah's research on looking at am I doing better than my father kind of a study begins to show that if you are from a particular ethnic or family background with a parent who is a graduate, as opposed to one in a family who isn't, and opposed to one in the bottom 40, and depending on your ethnicity or geographical, sub-ethnicity or geographical location that you are from, there will be, even with all the opportunities around, possibility that you will not make it on the socio-economic ladder, the reality and the face of poverty. Now, a lot has been said, and economists always use this, and some of us always say it, but I don't think EPU has taken it seriously. We talk about urban-rural divide, but on the ground, it's not urban-rural. Even rural, you have developed rural, you have interior, underdeveloped, forest-based communities or coastal communities on the other side. On the urban, you have affluent urban with private hospitals, private clubs, golf courses, gated. And then you have high-rise flats, highly densely populated, high crime, violence, drugs, problem with garbage clearance, basic public space, lights, lifts not working. This is the reality on the ground for people. And then if we explore migrant workers' living conditions and the amount of hours that they put, statistics doesn't capture these. And the reality is important. And I think I would conclude with this theme that the UN came up with the Sustainable Development Goals, and Malaysia agreed to it. And in last year, we submitted the voluntary national review on the SDGs, where we have adopted economic, social, and environmental. In none of our discussions of income, growth, sustainability is featured at all in terms of the Earth's resources or the nation or the globe. And likewise, human rights dimensions of civil and political rights in terms to right of participation, the right of unions, the right to organize yourself in the context of capital and the rich. And these are some of the realities that forest-based communities are facing today with big companies that have taken on their lands, or former plantation workers who have been displaced from the very lands that they have worked for long periods of time, or people in agricultural areas. And just one more word, and that is, I've heard a lot this morning as well of equal opportunities. I agree to that. But opportunities cannot be equal if you really look at disaggregated figures. If you're living closer to the forest, if you're far away, you might be living in Subang here, but you have no access to medical care. Daerah Petaling has no general hospital. You might have Sunway, you have Subang, and all these you might have, but you don't have a general hospital. You have to go to Klang or to Selayang in that context. But what is important equally is reducing unequal opportunities. Children or incomes or social mobility or context of social cohesion, which is fundamental not just for ethnic relations, but community living, the context of urbanization that has destroyed neighborhoods and communities that we need to rebuild. If not, we are all in a factory world trying to survive to make ends meet. I hope that adds to the statistical dimensions that there is a face of the poor, and the reality of poverty is horrific to sections that cannot come out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Datuk, for reminding us of how crucial it is to look at the on-the-ground realities, and also for bringing in the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals that we have been committed to. Now, can I call upon Hisham Hussain to make his presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tuanku, Tan Sri, Datuk, distinguished guests. One of the advantages of going last is that I don't have to cover all the stuff that they already covered. And I'm very happy Dr. Denison brought up the issue of social mobility, because that's something that I would really like to discuss as well. But if I can just bring out one other aspect, I think that's probably not been raised up so far, is really about the issue of age and aging and demographics generally in the context of inequality. I think one thing, I really loved what Alan did with the labor share, but if one of the things that struck me was that if you look at the experiences of other countries that have gone through similar transitions, and they have it really correlated with demographic transitions as well. So I suspect when we really dig down into disaggregated data on the labor share, I think age has a lot to do with it. If you look at Malaysia's age profile today, the biggest cohort now is between 25 to 30, roughly speaking. You don't earn much when you're 25. Max, if you look at data across the world, most people actually reach peak earning capacity at roughly the age of 50, between 40 to 50. So there could be a demographic component to this rising labor share, and that also implies that there is a natural limit to how far it can rise. We are a fast-aging country. Of course, coming from EPF, I'm supposed to mention that so I can tick off that KPI. But I think within the next 15 to 20 years, whatever progress we make in that will very naturally come to a stop. And I think also in terms of where market inequality is as well, that is probably where it's going to bottom out, unless we do something else. So that is a big consideration for me. And one reason why I raise this is that also coming from EPF, we have access to literally monthly data on wages. And there's been a lot of talk about wages being stagnant over the past decade or so. But it has been true for the last 2 or 3 years, but no longer. I think wages have started really increasing from, I think, July last year onwards, and quite strongly. But with one caveat, and it's highly unusual and we don't have an explanation for it. All the wage increases are going to people above the age of 35. Nobody below the age of 35. Below the age of 35, all our numbers are in the red, right? Or zero. So wages are increasing, but it's only for people of a certain age group, or people of a certain level of experience, or people in certain positions. And obviously, if you look at it from an income perspective, the people in the B40 are doing okay, I think. The numbers there are quite fairly strong. The numbers in the top 20 are very good. I won't tell you what the numbers are in the top 0.1% because we actually slice it down that far, but it's very, very good. Well above double digits, okay. But the people in the middle are not doing so well. I think specifically around the median to roughly about 10 to 20% below the median level, wage growth is actually still quite poor. So there is a fairly significant age component to inequality, and something that's, I think we really need to research a little bit more about. The second thing that I want to comment on, specifically on social mobility, and I'll go into this a little bit deeper. There is, of course, that KRI study on social mobility, but which looks at it from an intergenerational perspective. Are you doing better than your parents? What we're trying to do with the data that we have access to at EPF is trying to figure out intragenerational mobility. In other words, what's the possibility of you going up or down in the income distribution relative to where you were 10 years ago? And our numbers indicate that mobility within generations is actually quite poor. If you start off in the bottom 40%, chances are something like 40 to 50% of the time you will stay in the bottom 40%. And if you're in the top 20%, I think something like 60 to 70% of the time you will stay in the top 20%. So where you enter the workforce is very, very critical. And this mirrors my own journey in I think, researching inequality. You start thinking, okay, let's work backwards. Where does it come from? And then you think, okay, tertiary education, that is a very high correlation. But then you look at the numbers of who gets tertiary education, and it goes back to family background, right? Higher income families disproportionately send their children for tertiary education. So that's going to be something that we need to actually handle. It's not really about tertiary education, it's not secondary, it's not primary. It's what are the conditions that really boost income levels for those kids at the very, very high income levels. And I would love to say more on this, but I'm afraid I have to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jayasooria. So what I would like to do is to call for questions from the floor, and then we will take questions from the floor first, and then we'll put up some of the questions that have appeared on Slido, and I would like to leave a couple of minutes for the panelists to be able to make a final response. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, Madam Chair, I think my mind is floating in the same lake with Denison. Now, I'm very sentimental when Alan started his presentation by picking up para 134 of the second Malaysia plan. So that plan was drawn 48 years ago, before this building and this beautiful hall came into being. So the fact that you quoted that very para, which was formulated in 1970, post-racial riot of 69 and so on, when we talk about income distribution, reflected that was a masterpiece. That sentence was a masterpiece when we talk about income distribution and poverty. Now, I share a lot of the observation made by Denison. Now, bearing in mind, that para was crafted at a time when the quality of our civil servant at that time lacks in very high qualification. I hardly think in 1970 among the PTD we have anyone with PhD. But today half the Secretary General and the Chief Secretary are doctoral holders. But my fear here, as observation made by you, they become armchair administrators who do not really have in their soul the pain of the face of poverty. Let me just give you an immediate example, 1 minute. Yesterday, I happened to go to Kebangsaan Srinagar, and it was a shameful situation when you look at the growth of lalang and so on. What does that reflect? We have a lot of very qualified people, but we have the mentality of the third world, just like what Tun Abdullah Badawi feared at one time. We have a first-class facility, but we have a third-class mentality. So if we do not address this particular situation, we have too many people who are resting as armchair administrators. So what we wanted and what our aspiration to handle this thing will have to be re-examined thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take 2 more short questions from the floor, please?
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Siva. I think it's quite proven from the figures there that after the implementation of the minimum wages, it has sort of improved the livelihood of the B40. What I'd like to share or get an opinion from the panel is that how about the concept of social wages? Because in a way that it's very important that while that we also have minimum wages, issues that of basic needs in terms of education, whether it's subsidized or not, in terms of healthcare, because we find that as time goes by, most and most of these subsidies are being cut back. And that's what we see is how the government wants to do it. They want to cut back on subsidies. They want to make it more self-sustainable and so on. So in terms of social wages, I think it's very important that the government must play a role to ensure that education is subsidized, healthcare is being subsidized, housing especially. So this also plays a role in whereby even though we don't have very high minimum wages, but we don't push people to poverty. So I'd like to get your views on what would be the government's role to ensure that social wages are maintained and thus that we have a proper livelihood. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really conscious that we are running out of time. So if the panelists could look at the questions that have come up on Slido, and I'd like to give a couple of minutes to each of the panelists, starting with Alan, to make quick responses.
I guess the questions was asked during my presentation. I think just a quick few points. For the income data that I use is actually correct. This technical point first. The income data that I use is actually corrected for inflation. So it's adjusted for inflation. So the number that you have seen is actually in 2016 prices. So the equivalent number in 1970 is actually what you could buy in 2016 prices, right? So it's adjusted for inflation. On the first question there, I think important to highlight that income is growing. Income is growing and inequality is dropping. So it's not really inconsistent in what we are seeing. But beyond that, let's just highlight a number of points brought up by the panelists as well as some of the questions that was raised. I think on the question relating to policy, I would expect the next session will be much more interesting, right, with Prof. Jomo and so on. But let me try to shed some light on my thoughts. On social mobility, that's actually a very crucial point. And with regards to equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, I think it's important for us to realize that inequality of outcome today matters for equality of opportunity tomorrow, right? So in that regard, I think social mobility, I mean, it's very important for us to also put attention, give attention to the equality of outcome. And on wages, I didn't show the distribution of income by wages. There's something we have been doing as well to look at the data. It is available in detail level since 2010, the data. What I can share with you, some broad observation is this. The dispersion of wages by job category, at least those that was released by the Department of Statistics, the dispersion, i.e. the top jobs, professionals, and the bottom jobs, elementary occupations, they have not really declined, right? And the question is, why then did household income inequality decline? So this is I think, a question that needs a bit more research on to answer. It could be because of the structure of the household itself, or from transfer, right? And one point I raised earlier is that now there are more women who are in the workforce now than previously. Yes, there's still gap in terms of labor force participation, but we have made progress in actually closing that gap. It's still quite bad, but it's smaller now. I think that's an important point. I think the last point I would like to make is actually on the matter brought up by Professor Wee and Hisham as well, on jobs and wages. I think one key thing that is happening now is actually the polarization of, so what Prof. Wee showed was wages. What I think could have complemented the analysis a lot more is actually on the number of jobs that was actually created by those different job categories. So what we have seen over the last 10 years is that the share of job that goes to the blue-collar worker has actually declined. And the share of job that goes to the high-skilled workers, the professionals, the technicians, those has increased, as well as those at the bottom end of the job category. So there's a hollowing out in the middle. It's something that we observe in many advanced countries and many emerging countries. It has also been observed in Malaysia. But what we didn't see is actually a hollowing out of wages. In fact, the fastest growth in wages actually occurred not in the high end of the job occupational category, not for among professionals. It's actually among blue-collar worker, right? You can imagine the share, I'll end soon. The share of employment actually dropped, but the wages actually increased. I think this ties back to the point about foreign workers in the country. If foreign worker is a complement to mid-skilled job, that could have explained why the wages of mid-skilled job has actually increased. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe we could start with Encik Hisham, and in terms of your last words and responses.
Do you want to cover Siva's question?
Sorry?
Yeah, okay, never mind. No, I really
Just
don't have
in
much.
response and whatever else you would like
okay.
to.
I just want to address Siva's question just now on social wages and social insurance. I think as far as our fiscal policy is concerned, those are the biggest areas of reform that I think we really need. Healthcare, pensions, and I think having a social insurance scheme. And I know this is the most unpopular thing to say before an election, but I think taxes have to go up to support this. And we really need to really look at fiscal reform to actually support a lot of the aspirations that we have as a society. I think we need to understand that there are sacrifices that need to be made. And I think that basically is my stand on this, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Datuk?
Yes, thank you. I think I'll respond first to Datuk Sri's comment. I think I would recognize one of the major issues which is prevalent in the bureaucracy is a very silo approach to delivery. This is different from the post-NEP period or even previously with Tun Razak's approach of the center, his Red Book approach, where the Mesyuarat Tindakan Daerah should actually be much more multidimensional in addressing ground problems. And I'm one strong advocate of reviving the DO and district office role in this multidimensional approach of picking up poverty and inequality and other issues at the district level. And we have the ambiguity with the urbanization, with the city councils that don't have the mandate to cover the major federal government delivery. So we have a problem which in the past, 1970, I think approached with NEP in slightly different ways. I think to Siva's point, I would agree that the social cost on the poor is much higher with GST, likewise debt through repayment for higher education. I think it's, if a young person at 25 had a $100,000 debt to settle, it's either going to deplete all the EPF savings of the parents who are going to live up to 80 from, last job at 55 or now 60, 62. It's a tremendous deprivation if health costs rises. So I think government needs to relook at that in a critical way. I think the development planners have that, but I think somehow we have not pushed the advocacy agenda adequately. My final comment is on the PLI, which is up there. I would think Malaysia should stop using PLI, using figures of the poorest countries of the world, because we are at a different benchmark. And so the measurement, I think 11th plan is accurate in taking multidimensional, but expanding that to include other dimensions with the SDG brings out, and changing the indicators which are put at a very low benchmark. So statistically, there is no poor in Malaysia, but in reality, all around us are people who have major problems, and that's reflected in self-declaration of the poor to get their brim money. And that has a political implication. Thank you.
Thank you, Datuk.
Oh, yeah.
Professor.
Yeah, to continue, I think I want to talk about the civil service and the services to the people, and especially on an example is on health. Now, I think when the government provides services, you have to consider different aspects so that it really reach the poor. For example, the government does give medication for HIV. There was this case whereby the person cannot come to get the injection, right? So this person was going around asking for donations from the NGO. And in this time, the economy is bad, so even the NGOs are also having problems. So we say, okay, we cannot donate, So it's not just giving a service per se, but looking at whether it reached your target group. And yes, the DO, the district office is important, because I remember there was a time when the different departments will share the transport. In the case of Sarawak, the cost is expensive. So they will share the transport, one vehicle, every department will go in and so on. But nowadays, the cooperation, the coordination is not so, right? So you actually increase the cost, and in some cases, different departments might be having the same program at the same time, so that the community actually, which program to participate in, right? So the different departments, I think, have to coordinate and really look at, are we serving the people or are we just running program? So I think I will end there.
Thank you very much. I guess it's actually time for lunch, but before we break for lunch, let me again thank the panelists and to ask you to join me in expressing our appreciation to the speaker and to the discussants, and also to you, the range of questions and the number of questions that have been raised. And we're sorry that we could not take that everyone from the floor. Just goes to show the interest in the issues. And we'll need a lot more time to be able to discuss it. But we'll continue this afternoon. And again, let me ask you to join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lim.